Yeah, thanks, Sam, and thanks to Gabor and Luke for organizing this. It's super fun and a really interesting and diverse set of topics. So, there's certainly a lot of very impressive work in reinforcement learning, and and there's definitely been a lot of research sort of in the last decade in this area, and a lot of these recent exciting results spurred me to start thinking about some of these questions again, partly with intuitions from practice as to what might be some of the relevant questions. And it turns out, even when we look at some of our basic theory questions, they're still open. And this is a little surprising because at some level, look, we're just trying to solve an LP. Okay? We know how to solve linear programs. And even in this tabular case, it turns out there are open questions. And part of the reason for this is we're trying to solve a linear program, but we're not trying to solve it with the usual solution technique. So even in this exact case where, suppose we have an infinite horizon problem, we know how to solve this as a linear program. You just write down the linear program. But the complexity of doing this with other methods like value and policy iteration, it's very, very subtle. We don't really have sharp characterizations of how long those methods will work for the infinite horizon case. And we don't really understand perturbation in that case. And you could argue, look, I don't care about the infinite horizon case because in the real world it's finite horizon. But there's something strange going on in that oftentimes we think of the horizon time as a proxy for the infinite horizon one. And you might hope that if the horizon time becomes larger, our results don't explicitly depend on the horizon time. Okay? And the fact that we don't understand the infinite horizon case sharply doesn't mean we know how to characterize, say, various finite horizon problems as our horizon time becomes long. You might hope it depends on various mixing properties, and all we have are very crude upper bounds here. But I think that's one exact case that we don't know. The other case that people have been working on for quite some time now is the case where if we don't know the model of the world and we have various sampling access to it, again, we can't solve this as an LP. It depends on the particular model we have. There's a lot of work on what's the optimal regret when we have sampling access. There's an important question, not just for MDPs, but more important even machine learning and AI more broadly, and arguably even philosophically. When we're trying to interact with the world, should we be building a model of the world, and how accurate should our model be? And these questions, I'd argue, are actually pretty important in practice because all of these questions like TD learning, on-off policy methods, exploration, model-free, model-based, their analogs come in the tabular case, and the algorithms we have often come directly from this tabular case. So in this talk, we'll be looking at the question of, it'll be an overview of what are the known regret bounds and how do we actually get an optimal one in a precise sense. Okay, so let's start by looking at the episodic case where our horizon is fixed. So our horizon is h steps, and let's just define that. And the reason for that is we really don't understand the infinite horizon very well in terms of sharp dependencies. Okay, so let's just start with life being a little more simple. So Mark gave a really nice talk last time, so it's basically the same setup of having a Markov decision process, a finite set of states S, a finite set of actions A. We have some transition probability, which when you take action A and state S, it's a distribution over next states. There's rewards associated with every state action pair. So if I take action A and state S, I get some immediate reward. Our setting is one where we start, we play some game for 8 steps, and then we stop. We have this beautiful downward programming approach that if you knew this model, it's super easy to compute both this optimal value function, which immediately implies an optimal policy. Okay? You can also do this with a linear program. Okay, this is vector notation because think about this V as the value until the game is completed, and that's a vector. This is a vector because this is the distribution over the next states. Okay, so it's under 1. So questions about this? This is notation. We're going to be using this throughout. Okay, and this is this is just the model that we program if we knew the model. Okay, so the setting we're interested in is this setting where an agent is dumped in the world and has to play, and let's assume that the game just restarts after h steps. So you play the game for h steps and you restart. Okay, so I don't want to deal with this infinite setting. Okay, and what is a reinforcement learning algorithm? What's an algorithm? It just has some history of information. It uses that history of information and maps it to some next action given the current state it's in. Okay, and the game proceeds as follows. Let's say there's t episodes. T is going to keep growing. When it plays one episode, it just sees a set of parent, state, action, and a reward as well. Okay, so the algorithm sees in h steps, it sees one of these rollouts, and then it restarts. And it sees another rollout. Okay, and just in terms of definition, let this OPT opt is just the optimal average reward in an episode. So it's the sum of the rewards you get over h steps divided by h. Okay? And the regret is just, look, you're going to play for t episodes. This is the best you could have done. This is how much you actually do. So this is the sum over your average reward in an episode. Okay? And how do we make this small? Okay, so it's really just the usual definition, except there's state now. Right? If we think of a Marquis-Arm bandit problem, we pull an arm, and we pull another arm, and so on. So now we've got states. Make life a little simpler, and then every h steps we restart. And our goal is let's maximize this reward. Well, our goal is to maximize the reward, but we'll measure how well we do under this regret. That's just the setting, and how do we do this? Okay, so let's look at some lit review. And there's really two lines of results and thinking here. There are these model-based approaches. And the idea is, look, why should I throw away samples from the past? Like, if I've learned something, I should keep them around. I'll dump them into some estimated model, try to reuse the model. And these results, they typically need a number of samples. That's number of states squared times the number of actions. Okay? And intuitively, why is that? Well, how big is your model? A model is a distribution over states, but it's a distribution over states for every state action pair you're in. Okay, so the number of parameters in a model is state squared times the number of actions. So one way to think about like an MVP, think of it like a shortest path, but with like random edges for where you're going to go. Okay, so the model is specified by s squared times a parameters. Okay, and naively, if you want to estimate a model, this is how many parameters it's going to take. Okay, and but if you start thinking about it, to specify a policy, it's a far smaller set of numbers, because I just need to specify what I'm going to do in every single state. Okay, so you might hope for sample complexities that depend only on the number of states times the number of actions. Because I don't really need to describe everything else that's going to happen. I just need to know what I'm going to do. Okay, so maybe we could hope for finding ways to do well with a small number of interactions in the world. Where the number of interactions in the world are, we are able to do well in the world, yet we don't really have a very good description of the world. And the hope is maybe this is possible with these model-free based approaches. I'll go into the related work in a moment. And what this talk is about is trying to be optimal in a certain asymptotic sense, and do so in a way where we haven't ended up building a reasonable model of the world. Okay, so the question is, like, is this information theoretically even possible? Okay, so let me just go through the related work, and I'll formalize this question a little better. Okay, so we'll look at the related work in the context of these kind of model-based results and these model-free results. Okay, so well, the first result is, look, can you do this at all in some non-trivial manner? Because if I just act in the world randomly, it's going to take me forever for something good to happen, right? Like suppose the world is where I move to the right, or I can jump off the cliff and start again. Okay, and then I can move twice to the right, or I jump off and start, or I take the wrong action and have to restart. Okay, it's going to take me if I need to move k steps to the right, it's going to take me 2 to the k steps if I'm acting randomly. Okay, so sort of random exploration is bad. So there's a question of can we even solve this problem efficiently in any sense? And the first really remarkable result here was this E-cubed algorithm due to Michael Kearns and Satinder Singh way back in the old AT&T crowd. There's an insane number of amazing good RL papers came from that group. But this was an amazing result because it really showed that if an agent was dropped in an unknown MDP, it could somehow balance exploration and exploitation in a way that it not only figured out the right policy, but actually obtained the reward of a good policy. Because you don't also want to just spend forever exploring. And the previous results were ones where in the limit, you'll eventually find a good policy, but you haven't actually obtained the reward of that good policy. So Michael's and Satinder's result there was the first one to really say you can get dropped in a world, and in the limit, you'll actually end up getting the reward of the optimal policy. Okay, so it was a great result. Then there's a series of papers, definitely dropping lots of papers here. And most recently, there's a really nice result by Azar, Osband, and Mears, where in the limit, they give you the optimal asymptotic regret. So by limit here, when t starts becoming large, this is the best you can possibly do. Okay, and there's no factor of h here, so this is playing t episodes. There's no factor of h here because I'm normalizing the reward in every episode. So every episode, you look at your average reward within the episode. Okay, so for large t, this is optimal, but there's this lower order term, which is s squared a. And that's fine if we're taking the limit of large t, but what this means is the bound only kicks in when we have a non-trivial estimate of the world. Okay, so even though it might not become perfect in the limit, we still basically know what's going on in the world. Okay, so and somehow there's a feeling that do we really need to actually, information theoretically, figure out much about the world when we explore? Okay, and lower bound says no, but that's what. But this, in a sense, it really does seem real. Okay, we can maybe relax this, but we'll lose in the asymptotic rate. Okay. But this is nice because they did really pin down what the optimal rate is in the limit of large t. So then we can go to model free results, and the first kind of groundbreaking result here was Chris Watkins in his PhD thesis, I believe, came up with Q-learning. It was a way to, it didn't need a model. You could figure out the optimal policy in what they call an off-policy sense. That somehow you could act however you want, but you could still figure out what the optimal policy is, and you wouldn't directly estimate the model. Okay, the unfortunate thing is that, look, this thing's exponential in the worst case because it doesn't specify how you efficiently explore. So like in this example of I'm walking to the right, but if I take the wrong action, I'm going to fall off and I'll have to restart. Q-learning really is going to be an exponential time algorithm in many cases. Okay, but it's a model-free result that does converge. Okay, and the first big result in sort of this line of thinking was this delayed Q-learning result by Strail, Lippmann, Langford was on the paper, I don't know if Lehon was. There's a number of authors. But this was really a surprising result because they were able to give a model-free approach that in the limit had a regret that went to 0. So we didn't need to learn the optimal model, but the rate wasn't optimal in terms of t and the other factors. So we're dropping the poly h. But they didn't need to build a model. Okay? And that's and it's surprising because it's a really cool idea. Okay? And Shaba has also done some work refining this argument subsequently. So there's definitely a long line of very nice works in this area building up. And the question we're asking is, we really want to not build a model of the world, and the hope is like, look, the algorithms we have in practice in function approximation, they're supervised learning algorithms where we just somehow care about expectations. Like we never, if I'm doing image classification, I'm never going to try to figure out the distribution over images in the world. Like I just want to figure out a good classifier. Okay, and removing that, we thought was fundamental because then at least information theoretically we could say is, we can do well without having any non-trivial estimate of the model. But we also don't want to sacrifice on the asymptotic rate. And there feels like a bit of a tension here because having a model is good is because we reuse samples. These model-free approaches, they're bad because they actually just keep throwing away information, and asymptotically they keep throwing away information. And that seems really bad, to asymptotically throw away information. Okay, so I'll show you the result, and we'll go through sort of the intuition behind the algorithm and some of the previous algorithms as well.
Sure.
Yes.
So what does sublinear mean?
Right. So what I mean by sublinear is we would like a result that's sublinear in the model size. Because if we think of naively from computer science theory, right? You think of the size of the input problem. Okay? And in a sense, the input problem here is the model, which is size s squared a. Okay? And when we have sublinear results, we often hope that we have some oracle access to our model where we can do well in a manner that is sort of a smaller number of computations or queries than is taken to specify the model. So in words, it's
so if the exponent were a half, then I could buy that. But what's going on here? You want the average regret to be?
This one is sublinear, I'd argue. Okay, but it's not asymptotically optimal. Okay, so this latter one is sublinear because you can get a regret that's, say, less than a half. So here would be one concrete question. How long does it take you to act in some non-trivial way? Meaning, to say, get your regret to be less than a half or some
Average, get your average regret.
Yeah, your average regret to be less than a half. Okay, so let's just forget about the asymptote. So there's one extreme is like, when does the bounds kick in? Okay, and here it kicks in, you just need order SA samples. Does that make sense? Because you just divide by t, like when is this thing less than a half if I divide by t? And it's just order SA is how it scales. Whereas that thing, you actually need sort of s squared a before anything non-trivial happens.
I don't see why you don't need t to be SA cubed.
Oh no, because the SA are on the inside of the 3/4. So just set this to be less than epsilon, and then
less than epsilon t.
Yeah, less than epsilon t. Yeah, and sorry. Maybe I wrote that incorrectly. Oh, so maybe I mean 1/4. Sorry. Okay. So I think I wrote it incorrectly. Let me fix that. Yeah, that makes more sense because yes, sorry. It should be inside when I divide it by t. Sorry. So I wrote this incorrectly. Yeah. So Peter's pointing out that in fact, if you interpret what I said, it's completely inconsistent with this equation. So it should be if I divide by t, there should be square root of SA, or so 4th root of SA over t. I think I converted from average to, anyway, that's incorrect. There should be a quarter poly there. The bottom line is it's growing at a linear rate in SMA. hide that. So, so define what sublinear means. So this algorithm will present. So the main part of this talk is really an algorithm which both is optimal in the limit and doesn't need to build a model of the world, even non-trivially. So it's going to be some kind of sparse model, and so in the short run, it's going to have, like, what is the time it takes before the model does something before the algorithm does something non-trivial. Okay, and then it's only going to need states times actions number of time steps. In the long run, it is actually behaving well too. And I think what's interesting here is it's mixing up some new algorithmic ideas, and I'll come to that as well, because there's a feeling, I was talking to Nick in the break, there's a feeling that even when we're doing like a lot of these deep RL things, and yes, we'd also like to understand function approximation, but a lot of the things we're doing in these more sophisticated RL procedures in practice, they're basically variants of the tabular algorithms with function approximation built in. Q-learning, Monte Carlo tree search, like we have these exact algorithms. We don't understand how they behave with function approximations, let's forget about that. But in practice, we just bolt on these function approximation schemes, and a lot of the problems we have in the tabular case are the same problems we have in practical settings. And I think what's interesting here, as I used to argue, that there's sort of two algorithmic ideas that this is getting at that I think are very relevant, and we struggle with both. And in a sense, the theory here, when we develop it, is actually struggling with both. So I'll come back to that. But I think the algorithmic insights are interesting. Yes.
You cannot obtain this with running, or no, you cannot.
Right. So this is this is a great question. So this phased Q learning, I was actually just talking to Lynn about this, because I think in the earlier version, like I wanted to call this model free, and I don't think that's the best. Information theoretically, it is. Right, so the question is like, what would we mean by Q learning? We can sort of round it up to somehow say, look, we're going to keep track of some kind of state action values, and maybe do backups with confidence intervals. My concern with that is that I'll discuss it a little more when I show you this like crazy looking algorithm. But my concern is somehow you throw away samples with Q learning, so I don't know how you can get something like this with Q learning without losing either on the T or some factor, because you're doing backups with Q learning and you only back things up based on the current state you visit, and then you just throw away that sample. Okay, and you never use it again. Okay, and that's really disconcerting. And I don't have a lower bound. I mean, that would be an algorithm. Okay, so I'm sure like with that particular variant, one could come up with a lower bound. But this sort of broader class of algorithms, can I just somehow keep track of a Q function and maybe some confidence intervals or counts and get it to work out? Maybe one could. This algorithm, what it sort of stores is a little more than what's in the spirit of Q learning. But I think this is a very good question, that sort of how, sort of what are the right sufficient statistics for an algorithm to use. But as of now, nothing like this is even close for algorithms like Q. So this is with, I'll come back to the end. This is with Mengdi and my co-author. Yeah, so at the end I'll give you nice pictures of them. Yeah, they're awesome. And actually, this started with some work by Mengdi with Aaron Sidford and Yin Yu Ye, looking at variance reduction methods. She just came to me. I didn't know much about her work, and I started speaking with her, and I was like, man, she's awesome. She's doing really interesting work on variance reduction where you had a different oracle. And I was like, look, we should be able to do something like this in the online setting. So let me get back to that. So the outline, the outline is, we're just going to back up. We're going to look at this upper confidence algorithm. So that's actually an older algorithm. I don't know who, maybe Peter Auer. I mean, in spirit, it's older than that. And we're going to look at how that is applied to the RL setting. So this is this really nice result by Azar, Osband, and Werners, and get some intuition as to where that lower order term is coming from. We'll cook up just some like really naive thing that we might think about, like how would we fix it when we see that algorithm. So we'll just cook up some naive fix, see what goes wrong, and then look at how we can incorporate a certain variance reduction idea due to some recent work by Wang, Wu, Ye, and Sidford. And this is this idea was really in a different simulator model. So this is where you had some kind of this generative model. So they had work where how would you plan if you had sampling access to your model? It's a nice. See, this one and a subsequent paper is really nice. I would definitely recommend. I would definitely recommend looking at this paper because I think it's one of the more interesting. I mean, there's a lot of interesting work at NRL, but I feel this one, it's a very orthogonal idea to many of the other approaches, and it shares a lot of ideas from optimization. So I think it's worth it, and we're certainly utilizing it. Okay, so multi-arm bandits. Quick review. We're trying, so there's no state here every time you pull an arm. What's a good algorithm? Obviously, you don't want to pull the arm which has been most rewarding in the past. What you want to do is you want to take into account your uncertainty of each arm. So this is like the average reward of the current, of what you've seen when you pulled arm 3. What I actually know is that, look, I know what happened when I pulled arm 3. This is the average. Assuming some sort of central limit theorem argument, I also roughly know how confident I am in my estimated reward of this arm. Okay, and what I should pull when I care about the long term is not just the immediate payoff. I should give myself some bonus based on how uncertain I am of this reward. Because if I'm very uncertain, right, I should explore a little more. Okay, so and we really know very, very sharp rates here, and we can even fix lower order dependencies here. Okay, but the spirit here is I have to incorporate my uncertainty when I'm making my decisions, and UCB it's a really beautiful algorithm that most times you go to a new setting, you can just think about it for a while and have a guess as to what a natural algorithm is going to look like. And if you think about this reinforcement learning setting, about how would I solve this problem if I'm dumped into some maze or some stochastic maze? What you could do is this UCB idea where I keep track of uncertainties of every outcome, and I push those uncertainties through my dynamic program. Right? So this UCB for multi-arm bandit, this is just my uncertainty of immediate outcomes. You could somehow think about pushing these uncertainties through a big dynamic program. So let's just list. Okay, the picture is like, look, I'm going to pull this slot machine at every time step, but the slot machine actually has some state to it. So it moves around, and I know the state it is. So I want to somehow include a bonus for what happens, and based on my uncertainty, and I should somehow propagate my uncertainties through time, because I might be very sure what happens at the next step, but I might be very unsure 3 steps in the future if I take the left arm. And I need to somehow not just say I'm not going to pull this arm because I know exactly what's going to happen immediately. I might want to pull it because downstream I don't know what happens. Okay, so that's basically the spirit of UCD. So what is the actual algorithm here? Okay, so what we're going to do is we have some policy. Forget about how we got it for a moment. Just run it for an episode. Okay, and when we run our episode, okay, assume the reward function is known. Since I seem to have dropped it in the notation here. So you play an episode, you get one trajectory. So trajectory is the sequence of state action pairs that you visited. Then what do? Update your model. So this p hat this is just your empirical estimates of the underlying distribution. Okay? And now I construct a bonus. We'll see how we use that in a moment. But it's going to be, B of SA is going to be the square root of the number of times I've visited S and taken action A in state S. Okay? So this is like a central limit theorem kind of term. Okay, so now what would we do? Well, you just want to somehow dump in these uncertainties into your dynamic program and go backwards. Okay, so what do we do here? So the naive thing is like, look, I've got some estimated model. I'm just going to do dynamic programming with the estimated model. The problem with that is you won't end up exploring. This is just kind of following your nose. Okay? But if I take my uncertainty into account, and it turns out this is the right way to do it, it's actually interesting. It's like it's not obvious why this is the right uncertainty because you're somehow propagating information downstream. It's actually part of the proof. But it turns out that this very natural-looking form of a bonus is the right thing to do. This is sort of clearly the right bonus for the immediate outcome. But the fact that, well, at least in terms of its A dependence, but the fact that this is the right long-term bonus is pretty interesting. Okay, but you can prove it. They do it. So you just run this. So I start at the very end, and I'm just sort of doing this Bellman operations, these Bellman backups, with this bonus. Okay, and then I get this value function. With the value function, I can get a policy. And then I just go back to step one and play an episode. Again, the idea is like, look, one of two things are going to happen. Either I'm acting optimally, great, or I'm not acting optimally, but I should be visiting some region where I'm uncertain, and that should somehow shrink this thing appropriately. Okay, and then I shrink this, and I'll gain information. And I'll sort of learn that this part is bad. Okay, or I'll learn that some part is good. So that's what this UCB algorithm is. It makes a lot of sense. Like you see it. And why wasn't this analyzed like a decade ago? You see it. I don't know why. Well, maybe like it's actually a non-trivial analysis. Like it's clear that this is the obvious thing to do, but it's actually a subtle analysis to get it right. But they did it.
Should the B scale with the horizon as well?
I'm dropping some constants in it, and yes, I believe it.
If it's a confidence bound across V hat, then I guess that should be the right size.
Yeah, so I didn't actually tell you what it's a confidence bound on. Sort of in a sense, the reason is this V hat H plus 1, that's incorporated V's into the previous one. So this V isn't really the immediate confidence bound. It's this piling on effect from downstream. So it is true that, yeah, so with the piling on, so actually I'm not convinced there's an H. I mean, I dropped the constants, but you're definitely piling on H more confidence speeds when you're doing this recursion. Okay. So, good, yeah. It's really worth thinking about it because it's cute that it has such a clean form. Yeah.
There was a paper by Alex Sham and Michael Lippman, that 2008 paper. They had two forms. They had model-based interval estimation, which had the bonus inside a confidence interval, and then there was a bonus outside. It was a separate.
Yeah, that's right.
Is this the same algorithm? Is it something different?
So there they didn't explicitly talk about. They talked about it a bit, but they didn't translate into regret bounds. We actually use a lot of the paper. Let me come back to that. Yeah. So this is actually another. Well, it's helpful for us because we had some technical issue, but we looked at that paper and fixed it. But yeah, so there was work earlier by Strail and Lippman looking at how we come up with valid confidence intervals and essentially back-propagate uncertainties. And look, dynamic programs are nice because we know how to like propagate uncertainties as well. Okay, so this is that Azar-Osman-Muras algorithm. It's the one that in the limit gets the right rate of regret. That actually makes a lot of sense for these UCB style algorithms. So what's going on here? Okay, it's a subtle point, but I think practically it's it's pretty critical as well, is that blue term. Okay, so let me back up a moment. In a sense, if you look at like Darwin's equation, we don't really need, if you think about it, we don't really need to know the model to do this. We just need to get this quantity right in expectation. And we know like expectations are fine with a turn-off kind of argument. So if we had some kind of simulator, like the obvious thing you do is just run Bellman and compute this part through sampling. Okay, so you would hope like you could translate this into the argument that this part can be accurate because you're just estimating through sampling. Like you don't want to do this argument by saying I need to get my model to be accurate to the truth in an L1 sense. Like that would be a complete disaster. Right? You really want to go through this argument and somehow say I just need to get some expectations correct. Okay? The problem with RL is everything is like we just don't have independence. Okay, and the real frustration is that this v hat of h plus 1, it's really correlated with these p hats. Okay, and it's correlated in just a really frustrating way that I think hurts us in practice. Like this burn-in factor of s squared a, I think it's, things like this are real. And what's happening is that because of errors, you kind of chase your errors down. Like you think going left is a little better, and then you make a mistake and go left. And these errors compound in this really horrible way. And this extra term is really coming in due to the fact that things are not independent. If all these samples are somehow independent, everything would be nice. But they're not independent, and unlike the multi-arm bandit setting, where what you do in the future might depend on your history, things compound because if I make an error, it forces me into a very different part of the state space. Okay, and the main reason I want to say that algorithms like this are relevant for practice, that this style of algorithm we almost never use in practice. Like when we come up with values in practice or policies, it's almost always the case that somehow a value very closely is tracking a current policy. Like we rarely have some value that we estimate in some completely decoupled way and execute it. It's almost always it's almost always the case that we're estimating the next value with some policy with some previous policy that was very close to it. We didn't kind of just lump all this information together. And I'd argue that's the same reason here, because when you make mistakes, you wander off into a different part of the state space, and your errors just compound. And that's exactly the same thing that's happening in theory. Okay, so that's UCB. That's intuition for what's going wrong. It's just these tiny errors compound, and you can show it. It doesn't hurt you after a sufficiently large point in time. But that point in time is a little disappointing because it's when you kind of have a non-trivial estimate of the model. Okay, so what's the obvious fix? Okay, so let's forget about being efficient. Let's just try to force independence by throwing things away. Okay, so here's the naive procedure to try. Is when I do these backups, don't kind of use the same samples at time 5 that I used at time 3 to doing this backup. Right? Just try to somehow get quote unquote fresh samples every time. Okay? And when I do the backup for what I should do at the first time step, try to get fresh samples to figure out this expectation. And don't reuse things. Okay? Even that's going to break a little. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to execute some policy, say for one episode. But one thing you could try is like, look, I'm just going to estimate the distribution of the next state. I'm going to do it differently at each stage. So don't mix up samples between different stages. And then you would hope that this is, my backup, you would hope that like my backup at time step 1 is independent of my backup at time step 2 because I'm going backwards. samples are somehow moving. And that's almost true. Technically it isn't, and Tor actually pointed that out to us in our paper, right? That they aren't independent. And why aren't they independent? Because the trajectory you follow depends on what you did in the past and so on. But you can think about this as it's almost true, and this paper by Strehler and Littman formalizes that argument. So they give us to pretend like it really was independent, even though it isn't. And this paper by Strehler and Littman show that. Okay, but this is the naive algorithm. Try to ignore try to get rid of this dependence issue by being a little wasteful, where we don't mix up the samples we're using at time step 1 with time step 2 and so on. So just try to refresh that. Okay, and what does this buy you? Well, it's definitely an easier analysis, assuming we fix this annoying correlation bit. So Tor pointed us out that there's a correlation we're missing, but then he mentioned this paper by Strehler and Littman, might fix it, but yeah, it definitely fixed it. So, but sort of carrying out this analysis, you definitely get a sublinear algorithm, but it's wasteful. Okay, but it is good in that it's at least sharp in terms of its t dependence now, which makes a lot of sense. So for those of you familiar with these multi-arm bandit settings, root t is kind of the right dependence on the ring graph. Okay, and that we didn't have with those Q-learning approaches. But this is getting root t because it is a confidence-based algorithm. Okay, it has a root h here because it really is wasteful, because we're just, we're using new samples every time. Okay, so, but at least at least in terms of t, things are right-headed, but it's clearly wasteful. And at some level, look, have I thrown the baby out with the bathwater here? Because at some level, the point of a model is to not keep throwing away samples, and now I'm throwing away samples to fix this problem, right? And I feel like this is really, I find different ways of trying to explain this frustration. I feel model is very good to reuse samples, but this correlation effect says somehow we don't want to reuse samples because we end up chasing our errors, and how do we disentangle them? And this disentangles them a bit, but we're still losing. Okay, so what's the new idea? Okay, so the new idea is variance reduction. It's really a successive refinement procedure. This is common in many areas of optimization. You try to get closer, try to get a little closer, so on. So let's look at sort of why. One way to think about how we could try to gain things back. Okay, so forget about this for a moment. This V quantity, it's about order h big if we don't normalize it, right? Because it's a sum over h things, like near the end. So it is about, it's sort of size h. Okay, and if you were to do like a model, when you're getting samples, you kind of expect some perturbation to have an order h effect, because this quantity is order h. So if I have error here, it's going to blow things up by some kind of h factor. Okay, so when we're using a model, there is some h blow up, but we're reusing our samples over all of the h steps. Okay. In this case, these things are still as big as order h, but we're getting burned on top of this for another h factor because we're using different samples for all h steps. Okay, but if you start thinking about this, if things have kind of worked in the past, maybe I should be able to reduce my variance of this quantity, because I'm only using this for like one backup, and if I somehow knew this quantity well, maybe I could reduce my variance on it. So let's just, maybe I'll show you the equation and it'll become a little more clear what we're going to try to do here. And this is where it's trying to combine things from this this really cool idea by Sidford and Wang and Yang and Wu. Okay, so that's the top equation is the approximate Bellman update. Okay, we got this p hat v hat term. Yeah, we can certainly break it up into these two parts. Okay, and the key point here is v hat is a big quantity. Like that's about as big as h. And any time when we have large quantities and we're trying to do an expectation, it's worthwhile to think about its variance. And in this particular setting, when you think about it, you start realizing that maybe I could somehow reduce the variance of this quantity. Okay, so we certainly could write this quantity in this manner for some kind of reference vector v bar. Okay. And somehow, as we're doing things, you would hope that v bar is actually improving. Right? So we have to estimate this quantity, but maybe this one, maybe we should. It might be fine to say maybe reuse a lot of samples here, but when we're trying to update it around its sort of our current guess, maybe we can somehow get away with far fewer samples. So we can still draw, say, fresh samples for every step, but we're going to decrease the fluctuations because, at time, some little h, we only need to update, we only really need to estimate some kind of small difference. Okay, so I'm just sort of crudely writing it this way, but this is the basic idea of, it's successive refinement, right? It comes out all over in math. The question is, can you make it have teeth? But due to the nature of this problem, it actually makes a lot of sense. So the idea now is can we kind of pick up where we lost? So even though we're kind of breaking up our samples h times, can we smartly use it? Can we smartly reduce our variance? So we argue that we're making h updates now, but each one has a lot less variance, as opposed to kind of making one update with sort of quantities that are h big. Okay, and now we get the headache of the actual algorithm. The reason this is delicate is that, so if I told you this idea, and suppose that we forget about RL and I gave you a sampling model. So a sampling model is at every state action, you could give it to a black box, and it gives you a next state. Okay, suppose you had that black box. If you had that black box, the naive thing is you would just do Bellman with samples to solve it. Okay? And if you start thinking about it, you could actually do better than this naive thing with variance reduction. Okay, so my claim is when you read that paper, its spirit is you have a much simpler sampling model, but once you see this variance reduction idea, it kind of makes sense that you wouldn't just, if you had this sampling procedure, the naive thing is I just do it once. I go from the end to the beginning, and then I'm done. And I just use samples to do this backup. Okay? And once once I've seeded you with this idea, you would probably say, maybe that's not what I want to do. I would actually do it once crudely. Then I would reduce it. Then I would sweep from the end again and do it less crudely. Right? And that's what that paper does. They really do these sweeps multiple times. It's a lot like this paper, STRG. The problem with this setting is it's hard to understand when we can do this because we're acting in the world and samples are gathered in a very non-homogeneous way. Okay, but intuitively we know what's going on, that this guy we want to use most of our samples for, but hopefully reuse is fine because this is really accurate. This part is the part we want to do cheaply because this is sort of refining things. So here's the algorithm. There's a lot of bucketing. The frustration is, as I know, we don't know how to make it simpler. But let me get back to that on the final slide. Okay, so what's the idea of the algorithm? So step one, it's there's always some kind of step where you just run your current policy. What's different about it, step one here is at every state action pair, we keep track of how many times we visited it. Okay, we run our current policy until at some state action pair we end up doubling the number of times we visited it. Okay? So at that point, something good has happened, okay? And that'll definitely happen. So just run it for a while until you get this out. Okay, so now we have to do this variance reduction carefully. Okay, and so now when we solve the MDP, we're not just going to go from back to front. We're going to go sort of crudely from back to front, and so we always have this reference vector, and then we update our reference vector, and then go from back to front again, and repeat. Okay, so the spirit of it is, once we have our samples, that's all kind of inhomogeneous. You initialize your reference vector to be h, that's sort of as rewarding as can be. Start with v hat to be 0. Okay, now we've got to construct sort of two sets of samples. On basically half of all our samples, we dump them into p hat. Okay, and then the first time we run this through, okay, then we're also going to have a set of samples we use to update these differences. When we update the differences, we're always just going to use a constant number of samples here, because all we need to do is somehow make progress when we add in a difference. So the set of samples we use when we update the difference, that's always going to be a constant, because if I didn't make enough progress, I'll do it again, and somehow every time I'm making progress. Okay, so there's sort of really two p hats. There's an accurate one, and there's one where you run for a constant number of steps. So if you're familiar with this idea in optimization, it's really very analogous to that idea. Okay, so that's how we constructed our estimates, and then we run backwards to forwards with this reference vector, okay, on this accurate part, and then we update these differences on this crude part, okay, and then we get the next h, and we do this from back to front. Okay, we've done this once, okay, and then somehow we take v bar, update it with this new v hat, reset v hat to 0, and run this again. Okay, and we keep doing this until somehow we run out of samples. Okay, so this part is always super accurate, and we just run this. This part uses a small number of samples. Okay, and the point is, this is the part that's really reducing the variance in the algorithm. And this is sort of the algorithm. It's subtle because of the fact that everything's very, very imbalanced in terms of where things are accurate. So there's a little more bookkeeping that has to go on. In spirit, this is nice. I would like in answers to Sem's question, I would have really liked to say this is just Q-learning with variance reduction, which I think would be a beautiful thing if it was true. The reason it isn't Q-learning with variance reduction is because suppose at some state you manage to accurately improve its value. If there's another state that moves to it, I somehow want to immediately update its value because something else has snapped. In Q-learning, you kind of have to wait till you get to that thing again. So I don't know how to sort of make it as online as Q-learning without sort of drastically wasting things. Okay. So this is the spirit of the algorithm. I don't like the degree of bucketing that goes on. I thought about fixing it. I don't know how to fix it. I actually think this is pretty important practically. So are there questions about the algorithm? Because if not, I'll level. I'd say it's really a careful application of variance reduction, and there's a lot of details just to bookkeep all of these things, which is frustrating because the basic idea, I think, is pretty simple. And combining, both UCV and variance reduction are two very, very natural ideas. Each of them on their own, the analysis is a little delicate. Putting them together is definitely a headache. Okay, so in short, that this is definitely a part, it's definitely a part of a line of very nice work from the RL community. And I think this sort of puts these two, one old idea and a very new one to really get an algorithm which is, it kicks in before you ever have any kind of accurate model, and it really is asymptotically optimal. And the weird thing is I feel it's combining two insights that are a bit at odds with each other. So we really are building a sparse model here because we're reutilizing samples all the time. And that's sort of why it's not like Q-learning, because when we improve like at the last stage, this really does get propagated right up to the first stage with this sparse model. And that doesn't happen quickly in Q-learning, or at least we don't know how to prove it. But the thing that it's at odds with is when you have a model, your errors somehow, how do we avoid chasing your errors? And that's where somehow the successive refinement is. That in a sense we are being wasteful, but it just isn't hurting us too much because we're kind of holding out some set of samples to make successive corrections to sort of see where, it's like this tension that we want to have this model, but we keep trying to wander off into where the model is making errors. But somehow with the successive refinement, we're able to keep small chunks of samples around and keep doing like very incremental corrections. And the successive refinement, like in some ways, that's even more important in practice because any practical application, you're always doing something like TD with variance reduction and always trying to, very strongly couple where the policy is to its improvements. So at least I think this is exciting because it shows that in Spirit we need to incorporate, I don't know about need, but I don't know of any other technique to make it sublinear without this successive refinement procedure. And even in the Oracle model of having this generative model, it's not obvious how you can improve on the naive procedure without this variance reduction. So I was just talking to Nick at the break, but I think a pretty interesting question is, how do we deal with models in practice? And this is a bit weird because in a sense we're doing both. We're like doing a model, but on the other hand, the successive refinement is like a very on-policy procedure. And I think it's pretty necessary to incorporate some effective ways to explore in practice. The thing I feel a bit about now is there some kind of obvious function approximation variant of these variance reduction techniques and exploration? I think, as I mentioned, this is joint work with Mengdi, she's at Princeton, she's awesome, and Lin, who's actually has 2 doctorates. He's pretty awesome. He got them at the same time, and he's really fun to work with. So thank you.
I want to see if I understand the core intuition here. If I just gave you a bag of data and there was no dependencies on the past or how you collect the data, you could construct an unbiased estimate of the value function. And then that one step of UCB would be the right thing to do. So is the issue that we don't ever have this, as soon as we start collecting data, we don't have an unbiased estimate?
Even if you give me a big collection of, so this is why this variance reduction thing, but even if you give me this big bundle of data, and suppose it was from this generative model, okay, you could do one backup independently if you kind of use, suppose I just put everything into one big model, I get my first backup independently. But then I have to do h minus 2. But I've already used my backup at 1. So now you've got this dependence issue.
Sure, but that's orthogonal from the exploration question in a sense. That's not how do you actually estimate the value function from data.
But in a sense, I would argue that's really coupled because when you collect this data from exploration, suppose we just collect it in this big bucket. How do I come up with my policy? See, it's harder in the exploration question because then everything's inhomogeneous, like where these samples are. But there is this question of like, how do I actually come up with my, run this UCB, because you are running some sort of dynamic program. And the problem with running the dynamic program with all the samples mixed together is your errors just somehow propagate in this really annoying way. And somehow a successive refinement is a way to fix it without too much expense. Like one way to fix it is just bucket it into h things. That's fine, but you actually just lose a factor of h. Okay. But these issues, in a sense, even that has an analog in the case where you have this generative model. So I think that first paper actually gives some insight. This one is like, I think it's important, like if we're, for those of us in thinking about exploration, I think this is really, I don't know another way to get rid of that term. And I feel that error blow up. Like we actually just pay this in practice all the time. Like, there's some little error and then, oh God, like everything just crashes.
About the mixing phase?
The infinite horizon. Yeah, so this is the question. So Peter Auer has this result for the infinite horizon case. I should put him there. And they have a notion of, what do they call it? The diameter of an MVP. The frustration is that's a very sloppy quantity like it really doesn't match the lower bound. And the frustration is that if you want to think about this technique of successive refinement, the only way I know how to do this is we need to understand value iteration. We don't understand value iteration exactly in the infinite horizon case. Like even if I told you the optimal policy mixes in some certain amount of time, we don't have any idea of the behavior of value iteration. And that's clearly not the right assumption. Like I somehow fundamentally feel, the infinite horizon case is, I think, truly tricky, both even in the LP setting, if we don't solve it like an LP, and in the approximate setting. So another way to think about why the infinite horizon setting is tricky. Like I feel there's also no way to ever get a logarithmic regret in infinite horizon without some exponential trade-off. And the reason is, how do I know when to stop pulling, I'm going to slam against this door. Like, how do I know when to stop doing this? Because there might be some, particle behind it. And here's the lower bound. So if I ever stop slamming against this door, okay, then that's good because I'll pick up the rest of the reward. Okay? But in another world, there could be something infinitely rewarding behind it. And there's no actual way to make this trade-off formally. Like I give you lower bounds offline, so that this will basically lead to no log t regret unless you have. I can formalize this. But that's what I'm saying. Like the most natural one is assume a bound on the mixing time, and then when we start instantiating those, we get loose upper bounds. And my concern is we're actually designing algorithms in the wrong way based on. I think when we do those bounds, I think you're better off just making it finite horizon and doing it. But because these bounds, they don't like we don't know of any matching lower bounds for the infinite horizon case. Is my concern when we make these bounds. And I think the simplest way to phrase this, we don't even know how long value iteration takes with a known model, and that's pretty bad. And we also don't know, like, if there's an error in an LP, how much does it get blown up? Should we take a break, or what is next?
Yeah, I can just take a break. Yeah, thanks, Sam.